no peace. Unidos, jamás será vencido. We want you all. To the west side, to the south, to the south. We want you all. We want you all.
What do we want? Justice. When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Justice.
When do we want it?
Now.
All right, y'all. There's a lot of us over here. It's a lot of people. It's a big turnout. And we're all united here because it's enough police violence, enough police impunity. We're gonna have a few minutes of silence. 1 minute of silence for Mark Nevares. 1 minute of silence for Adam Toledo. 1 minute of silence for Anthony Alvarez. So 3 minutes of silence.
Welcome, Chicago. This is Jerry Vasilatos for Chicago Corner. Some more sobering material and footage from last night's protests that began in Logan Square and continued on to Mayor Lori Lightfoot's house late into the evening. I'm going to have a few guests with me here this evening. I've got Kit Cabello standing by in the queue, but I wanted to cover a couple of points that I think are pretty salient as we continue coverage of the protests and the larger issue of excessive force and police escalation, not only in the Toledo tragedy, but in what happened last night after the protests, with protesters being arrested after their peaceful protest. A note on last night's show, I did misreport some information regarding Officer Stillman, the officer who was involved in the shooting. According to AB7 and the Invisible Institute, an investigative organization that tracks police misconduct, said Stillman has 3 misconduct complaints since he became a Chicago police officer in 2015. 2 involved improper search. None resulted in disciplinary action. There are no use of force reports to indicate Stillman had fired his weapon before. What's interesting to note here is that Stillman was deployed in Afghanistan as a Marine before joining CPD. And what I find kind of fascinating about that is that when we hear from veterans who are offering their insight into some of the situations we see on the streets with police violence, military training de-escalation via USA Today, according to opinion contributor and former Marine Kevin Mott, first, they have a do no harm approach. Accountability helped service members like former Marine Kevin Mott succeed in high stress situations. Those rules can do the same for police, he says. A core tenet of counterinsurgency strategy is first, do no harm. It's the spirit that guides decision-making in environments where the use of force can badly damage a campaign. To be clear, police aren't battling an insurgency, and the situation in our streets calls for drastically less militarization, not more. But the spirit of the saying is a helpful guide to protecting and serving a community deeply mistrustful of law enforcement. Military rules of engagement establish explicit escalation criteria and require service members to exhaust all nonviolent options before resorting to force. His Marines and those he drilled relentlessly on de-escalation procedures and techniques, he says, we knew we would be held administratively and potentially legal accountable if we broke those rules. Police also should be held accountable to clear rules of engagement. The nation has now witnessed scenes where officers employed a disproportionate use of force on marchers. The officer says, had I targeted unarmed protesters and reporters in those ways, I would have been court-martialed. Any law enforcement leader who sends officers into the streets without clear rules of engagement focused on de-escalation makes officers and their community less safe. Another lesson from the battlefield and its presentation and tactics matter. If law enforcement officers come dressed for combat, they send a signal to the community to prepare for battle. I learned quickly that interactions with Afghan civilians, especially angry ones, went much better when I removed my sunglasses and helmet and put away my rifle. The police, too, can lower tensions by taking off riot gear and showing tactical patience. Not every provocation requires an immediate response. Resisting the impulse to act in situations where there is no immediate threat to life or limb buys time for cooler heads to prevail and space for nonviolent solutions to be employed. Reflecting on my own combat experience, it's the times I chose not to use force that ended up being the most impactful for the communities I served. Police officers, like military officers, take an oath to protect and serve their communities. As a country, we have a long way to go and such work to do before our communities of color feel like that oath applies equally to them. And again, that came from former Marine Kevin Mott via USA Today. And also responding to recent events we've witnessed, Iraq veteran and former infantry officer Kevin Kardonsky wrote on Facebook that if soldiers were so reliant on lethal force, quote, we would all be in jail for life. According to the Police Executive Research Forum, new officers typically spend nearly 8 times as many hours learning to use weapons as they do learning to de-escalate. That's backwards. Sonny Haynes, a former Army infantryman and Iraq veteran, says it didn't take a rocket scientist to know killing an innocent civilian was a surefire way to create enemies. Of course, we can't paint police, most of whom are competent and professional, and many of whom are veterans, with a broad brush. There are great ones, good ones, decent ones, and bad ones, but neither should we continue to provide local departments with military-grade vehicles, body armor, and weaponry without insisting they effectively train their officers in de-escalation, which is a point I made last night with Kit. So I have Kit and Casey here for our conversation tonight. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
How you doing?
Hey, Kate. So I want to introduce everyone to Casey. Casey is our co-producer and videographer who's provided so much of the amazing footage in the streets of the protests. Oh, we lost Casey, but hopefully he'll be back in a moment. I know he's on Wi-Fi. There you are. And he's also a member of the Chicago Corner team that's out covering these events. So given some of the stuff I just shared regarding military officers offering their opinions on what we're seeing in the streets with the continued problem of police escalating as opposed to de-escalating. Kit, I know you're a former Marine. What are some of your thoughts on what these officers had to share?
Here's the thing. Those military officers who shared whose opinions and posts that you shared right now to our audience, let's be real honest. This is based on fact, because in regards towards military training, whether United States Marine Corps, United States Army, National Guard, U.S. Air Force, Navy, I mean, there are rules of engagement and what you can and cannot do. And the amount of escalation that we're seeing by local police here in the United States, it's vastly different than what I went through with training in the Marine Corps and what anyone else that served in the military as well. It's just, we see the immediate action of lethal force being taken by police, not only just here in Chicago, but nationwide. I mean, how many times have we seen stories where, again, police shot somebody and the person already surrendered, or the police used a deadly chokehold and that person was already detained? I mean, enough is enough. If there's no way they trained that in the military. And I want to be very clear, like with what we're seeing here firsthand, if you compare the amount of training that we see by our police and compare it internationally towards, let's say, countries like Canada or Great Britain or Germany, for example. I'm just using those as an example. In many of these other countries, it takes 2 years before they let a new cop on the street, because they got to go through training. They got to learn about everything about de-escalation, using non-lethal force, before even going into learning how to shoot a gun. And let's be very serious here. Being a police officer is a dangerous job, but what we're seeing here in the United States is the police are always shooting first, asking questions later. And we all saw the video of Adam Toledo, the young man. Yeah, he did throw the gun behind the fence, but his hands were up when the cop said, hands up. The kid had his hands up. He didn't have any weapon in hand, and the cop fired anyways. They don't train that in the military. Once someone's surrendering, okay, the person has surrendered, you got to detain them. That's it. And the sad fact is, and I said this on yesterday's show, we're going to see more videos like this eventually surface as time goes on. This is just one example. We're barely even scratching the surface. We're barely even really looking into the amount of incompetence and brutality and unchecked corruption that we're seeing by our police force nationwide. And this is why people are doing these protests and calling for defunding the police or abolishing the police, because something needs to change. And if we just continue down this pathway, how many more young people, how many innocent people are going to be hurt by this quick reaction of shoot first, ask questions later?
Yeah, no, you make some very good points. And as a former Marine, I mean, I thought that some of your insight on this and what these officers said really made a big difference. Casey, I want to share something else that I collected from social media in regards to de-escalation from the police. So, I'm sorry, let me take it back a point. You have officers not exercising de-escalation in the field when it comes to trying to catch a perp, de-escalate so that there's no lethal force used. And then when you've got protesters out, demonstrating against that kind of escalation, the cops use those escalation tactics against the protesters. One of the things that we're seeing with the protests the other night, the protests ended up at Mayor Lightfoot's house, I believe, at the end of the evening, where police arrested protesters. This came from Sleepy Socialist on Twitter. After a 5,000 plus peaceful march for Adam Toledo, Chicago Police Department decided to escalate and arrest a protester going home. They're now in full riot gear facing off folks who've done nothing wrong. It doesn't matter if you're peaceful or not, cops will find a way to agitate. In regards to the protest ending up at Mayor Lightfoot's house, I had discovered this via a Facebook friend who was talking about some stuff that Mayor Lightfoot said in regard to de-escalation 3 years ago. It's been 3 years since she said this, and 2 since she's been in office. If she felt this strongly about creating a police policy around foot chases, she's had half of her term to do something about it. This is what she said in that interview. On the current iteration of the police consent decree and the revisions we'd want to see as mayor, what Mayor Lightfoot said is the other thing that has got to change is foot pursuit. We saw, this is from 2 years ago now, or no, 3 years ago. She said, we saw earlier this summer a young man who had a gun, was fleeing the police, discarded his gun, about ready to jump over a fence, and got shot in the back by the police. Foot pursuits are extremely dangerous. We need to have a real policy now. We don't need to wait 3 years as the consent decree allows. This is a real and present danger for officers and civilians that are being chased and other bystanders. We've got to get that right. She knew it was a huge problem that is lethal, and she did nothing. Now she's going to try to make herself out to be the savior if she creates one. It's crazy. She said this 3 years ago, and it took Adam Toledo getting shot because they didn't institute these new foot pursuit policies to, create a change in police training, which then brings us to the present with the protests and what we saw last night and what Casey sees a lot as a protester and videographer and someone who's very, I'll let you, Casey, share some of your experiences in the field shooting video and what you see with police escalation during these protests.
Well, firstly, I would just like to say that she has had 3 years to implement a Citizens Police Accountability Board, which, if I'm not mistaken, is something that she ran on and still hasn't followed through with. And I think if we had that, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the timeline would be, but I guarantee you that a civilian office, with elected officials can handle, changing like the laws around foot pursuits far more effectively, because currently, as you guys know, it's like all appointed by the mayor's office. And so it's just too cozy, that relationship between the police and the mayor, and it's historically been too cozy, and that's the real problem. And so when I go down to Wrightwood and Kimball or whatever, and I see like 100 cops standing in front of her house, right? People are, kind of walking around the block, we march up Milwaukee, go down Logan Boulevard, loop back around and stuff. I feel like they're just cops. I read there was one person who did report on Twitter that because after filming I peeled off a little bit earlier, but what they were saying on Twitter, is that there was a sergeant trying to call back the line of cops in riot gear, telling them to like, hey, fall back. But they, as a collective, insisted on standing in the middle of Milwaukee, of blocking the streets where, like, after most people had dispersed, and the crowds are usually pretty good about getting people home safe. Like, one of the things we chant is like, who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. And it's always like a big loving group of people usually who are trying to make sure that everybody gets home safely. People offer each other rides. Usually some organizers will have like Uber certificates for people who like really need to go very far or who have like a hard time getting around. A lot of people bring bikes, so like crowds are pretty good at dispersing, but like there's always like a mistrust. And as you said, Kit, that mistrust is based on like an adversarial relationship that the police assume, right? I think, and there's a lot of machismo that is wrapped up in that, right? Like they hear people talking shit to them all day, and so they want to like go out there with clubs and be like, oh, okay, so you still got that big talk, right? Well, okay, motherfucker, take off your badge and your helmets and your batons and your armor, and see if you can actually stand up to a crowd of 5,000 people, and they know that. It's, I don't know, it's a really like, how do I say, like the gap in understanding and the gap in empathy between like cops who they throw on the front lines for these protesters against or compared to the people who are organizing them and participating in them. It's just such a huge gap. Like we're literally living in two different Chicagos, and when I think like when you amplify that that mistrust, you amplify that difference of opinion and ideology, and when it's applied, what happens is you get a force of people who, to a lot, feel as if they're not only occupying their neighborhoods, but when, if you're chasing somebody down, and as a cop, psychologically, if you're going into this chase, like with this person who you've already otherized in your mind, and they put their hands up and you have all this adrenaline pumping, and I mean, he pulled the trigger, and I was looking at the footage, and I counted frames, like, he didn't get a full, it wasn't even an entire second that went by between him saying, put your hands up, and the moment where he pulled the trigger. And, Kit, it's interesting. I actually had no idea that you were a Marine. I think, Jerry, you told me it before. But Kit, have you ever heard of something called CDT? A friend of mine who's in the military told me they trained this. It said it stands for cover, distance, and time. Does this sound familiar or something to your training?
It sounds a little, maybe they changed the acronyms a little bit, but I know that when I was in training before I went for my first tour in Baghdad, this was the green zone. The rules of engagement were, you just can't just shoot willy-nilly. You just can't just, because the green zone was a big international district. It wasn't just not only Americans and Iraqi nationals. There was a lot of foreign dignitary, foreign military there, foreign ambassadors there. So you had to be very careful with what you were doing while you were there. So the fact that we're seeing this with again, I'm glad you brought up, because you are much more familiar with editing and filmmaking than I am, and the fact that you counted on the frames, because even then, while I'm not familiar with counting on the frames per second in a video, he wasn't even given a chance to really surrender or even go on the ground or nothing.
No.
Yes, he threw the gun behind the fence. Hands were up in the air. The cop said, "Hands up." Kid, scared probably out of his mind, hands up, and then the shot was fired, and then the young child goes down, 13 years old. I've never seen anything like that, and that is not approved by any training that I went through, and I'm pretty sure it's not approved by any training that's going on right now in the United States Marine Corps.
What I was getting at, like, to answer my own question, is like, this is, again, like you said, I guess, they do be changing acronyms a lot, but CDT, as it was explained to me, stands for cover, distance, and time.
That's
right?
what I remember reading about.
Cover. If you can find yourself some cover as an officer, you don't have to worry about anything affecting you. You're safe. You can regroup for a minute. You can think what to do next. You can, right? So the next one is distance. If you have a lot of distance between you and the subjects, but still maintain like a visual on them, again, it's for safety of everybody involved and allows you more time to calculate. And the T, of course, the last one is time, right? If he had given himself just a second to actually look at what is going on and realize that he's staring into the face of a fucking kid, you know, and it just, they go in so trigger happy. They go in so trigger happy. And I really liked what you said the other day when you're like, the example of the firemen, right? These are two people who have very dangerous jobs, and one of them is afraid to go to work every day and the other one is not. Of course, the one that's not is the firefighter, right? So
only one of these men fears for their lives is the meme. It's like they show a firefighter, right, a police officer. Both these men know the dangers of their job. Only one claims they fear for their lives.
Yeah, and you know, to me, that's just something that is inherent to American policing. I am not well versed enough in like the sociological and anthropological history of, you know, the country to really dive deeply into it. But I mean, when people say it feels like an occupying force, they're not that far off, right? I mean, the basis of policing in this country is slave catching and militias grabbing land from natives, right? And so there's a racial element when you're having like people who have this like I know we're familiar with how like dogmatic some police training can be, and they'll say things like, you are the wolf in the crowd of sheep and you must protect and you can die at any moment and everybody's out to get you. You know what I mean? Like they're filling their heads with so much like I said, adversarial propaganda. And it's almost like this weird psychology where they see themselves as an occupying force. And because of that, they feel like they have to defend themselves as much as or more than the actual communities that they're intended to protect. I'm not saying that they do that like on the surface level. Like if you go and ask a cop, like, hey, do you feel like you're a military occupation? It's like, no, of course not. But it's the fact that you can get, I've had more training as a boom operator. I've had more training as a 16-year-old learning how to drive than a cop on average has learning how to like deal with people.
De-escalation.
And there's so many gaps, like I said before, between like empathy and culture and understanding. And it is really all tied into race. And a lot of people don't like to talk about that, but it is. And so like, just again, the psychology of these cops that go into a foot pursuit and feel the need to pull a trigger on somebody is like less than a second after giving them a command, or less than a second after busting into their door, you know,
Breonna
Taylor. Exactly, right. And they just come in. And then I think there was that fellow in Texas too, who was, the cop came home and she thought, oh, I thought it was my apartment that I was, you know, like, you people are insane, you know? And it's like the combination of this really, really dogmatic training and a lack of actual training for like you said, like military training where you're like actually cool under fire, like walking into a burning building kind of cool, you know, where you just, they just take lives. And it's completely unnecessary. And I think at this point in 2021, about the same number of people have been killed by police as have at this point in 2020. So even after a year of really intense protesting, literally nothing has changed.
Oh,
right.
For decades.
And let's not forget, like, again, because I'm glad you brought the amount of training that the police do get. You know, a barber, let's take, for example, somebody who's trained to cut hair, they go through schooling longer than a cop does in this country. Our colleague, Daniel Lufter, has brought this up. Lee Camp on his show, Redacted Tonight, brought this up. And the sad fact is, it's not only just, is there just this lack of empathy with the police that we're seeing, but real lack of accountability at the state and federal level by our elected officials. let's just bring up the George Floyd situation where that one police officer who, again, murdered George Floyd, he was allowed to continue on his job thanks to the help and the blind eye of Amy Klobuchar, U.S. Senator. I think we all forget that, and yet she had the audacity to even show up during George Floyd's funeral.
Wasn't that crazy seeing her there? I mean, it was just like a Saturday Night Live skit. She has the nerve to show up there after she had something to do with that cop. Continuing
keeping his job, and I don't mean to take it all away, but there's one thing I do want to address.
No,
and I think
please.
on behalf of everyone that's watching this and the growth of this channel, and that is number one, Jerry, Casey, Nico. You three have done phenomenal work with getting a lot of good content and video footage of what's happening out there in the city of Chicago. And I think there is an echo somewhere, but I guess we'll worry about that later. Keep on doing this great work that we're seeing, because we need to show that there's another side of Chicago, not just one that's presented to us on corporate media.
Appreciate that, Kit. Hearing everything that comes from the military, and then I think we made this point the other night too, going back to Casey's comment, the cop chose to run into the alley without backup. And I'm sure in that adrenaline rush in that moment, he figured, well, what's his way out? If he has to, he's got his weapon. And in that split second, he wasn't making the proper judgment call that I think comes down to three terms: de-escalation, empathy, and accountability. That's what we really need to keep pushing here. I want to welcome Nico to the live stream. Nico is one of our other videographers who's helped Casey and I out in the field as we've been going out and covering different segments, the protests and ongoing news. And I when we were out the other night covering the first night of the Toledo protests and the vigils, that's when I learned that Nico actually lives in a little village. And I thought some of the perspective he was offering as we were just out there rapping on the street while we were getting footage for our news story was really, really relevant. And I thought it would be important to have a member of that neighborhood and that community, being that we are Chicago Corner representing all neighborhoods, hear from somebody who knows the youths in that community and grew up in that community to provide some perspective regarding this. Because again, going back to some of the stuff I found on social media this past week, as we're talking about Adam Toledo, some of the most odious, uninformed social media comments like these. This came from Reddit. This child was firing a gun in public. The outcry would be so different if he had been shot by another gangbanger or if he had shot someone else. The bottom line here is, what happened is unfortunate, but this child was not innocent. We need to stop thinking with our emotions and look at the facts. Y'all only tripping because a cop was involved. A wonderful response to that Reddit post. It's called shoot, don't shoot training. They emphasize think before you shoot. Plus, the cop shouldn't have gone in a solo foot pursuit to catch an armed suspect, let alone follow him in an alley leading up to an empty parking lot in an area that's known to have gang activity. He should have waited for backup, which came literally a minute later, thus not putting himself in that dangerous position all alone. The cop did a terrible job of communicating. He yells, "Show me your hands." Toledo raises his hands, and the cop immediately fires a shot. I get that adrenaline makes things difficult, but if this guy had just given clear orders and wasn't so quick on the trigger, Toledo might still be alive. Another comment: I'm not a cop. I'm not trained in firearms. It's not my job to serve and protect. We were told all week that he aimed a gun. I don't even see that. These cops are lying sacks of shit, and the whole department from top to bottom needs to go. There are no more good cops, in my opinion. Have you ever dealt with CPT in an instance where they've ever solved any problem? I haven't. Now, these are comments from Reddit. Lawyers are ethically responsible for reporting colleagues who violate the professional code of conduct. Why aren't we seeing that more in the police departments? Everyone acting like they somehow misrepresented things or got bad information. The police and prosecution lied full stop in smearing Adam before this police video was released, which led to the protests. This is what they do. It really brings me pause when I see someone defending CPD in this subreddit. Wait a minute, I'm sorry, let me catch. Oh, here it is. I'll never forget the extent to which users in this subreddit were frothing at the mouth for this video to be released because they believed it would immediately exonerate the cops. I wonder where they are today. And this is where I wanted to bring Nico into the conversation. Let me just kind of start this out so you can respond, Nico. Adam Toledo was a 13-year-old kid Police killed him while he was unarmed with his hands up in the air. Interestingly enough, we see a lot on Kyle. If you guys have seen on social media, when Kyle Rittenhouse was up in Wisconsin shooting and killing 2 people with an AR-15, police let him go home. Dylan Roof was brought a Burger King by police after his arrest, while Toledo, who was pictured with his hands in the air moments before cops fatally shot him, has been painted as a dangerous gang member. Sean Hannity described Toledo as a 13-year-old man. Comparatively, Fox News programming that aired in 2020, Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old who traveled across state lines with an unlicensed AR-15, shot 2 people to death and injured another while counter-protesting a rally in support of Jacob Blake as a little boy trying to help his community. It's also worth noting that Andy Nico created an entire Twitter thread rationalizing Dante Wright's death because of an alleged warrant and missed court date, but describes Rittenhouse as a teen vigilante. Obviously, there's a racist narrative here that allows white perps, white kids, to literally get away with murder. And when you have a youth like Adam, who surrendered and followed all the directions and is gunned down, he's immediately painted before the police. And that's the other thing, is like, we had 2 weeks where they sat on the police footage and we heard, he turned, he aimed a gun at the cop. It was escalated by Toledo, and we all saw what really happened.
But
anyway, Nico.
But the real thing is, we all saw that footage and we all know what really happened.
Yes. Absolutely. We have other people on social media. What was a 13-year-old doing out at 3 a.m. and especially with a gun? Lack of parenting right there, and they want to blame the police because they didn't raise a child to not do a crime. You know, I actually responded to that comment on Facebook because on Friday afternoon, Don Terry, director of Police Department's Office of News Affairs, told Block Club Chicago that Adam Toledo was reported missing on March 26th. And all we've been reading is people saying, where was the mother? Why didn't she know he was gone? She knew he was gone. He was reported as a missing person. The following day, police checked with the boy's mother, who told them he had returned home. She did not report him missing again, so that case was considered closed. As for the delay in telling Adam Toledo's mother about the killing, Terry said police spent 2 days trying to identify the boy's body. He said they called Adam's mother after seeing his description matched the recently closed missing person case. I need to check some of the details on that because I read some other conflicting information that I unfortunately didn't save before coming on tonight about. I thought he was still reported as missing when the incident happened. But here's something else interesting that I found that I think is really relevant to our conversation, Nico. The people who are blaming parents and character assassinating a 13-year-old are using defense mechanisms to protect themselves from the realities not only many children face, but many of them faced. Our society of oppressors has invoked fear in so many people that one of the drugs people who don't have much power use to keep themselves sane throughout avoidance is to pretend that they are in control of their own and their children's lives. Because for some people to face the truth, they and their children are under siege, their lives fated to poverty and violence. No matter what they do in their personal lives would be too much to bear. And also against everything white European colonialism has taught us, that freedom comes from pulling one's own bootstraps up. For every Oprah, there are 100 million Adam Toledos. So one of the things Nico and I talked about the other night was the smearing of Adam, and you were sharing with me what it's like for kids in this neighborhood, in this community. People come in with quick judgments. What about the parents? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that, as a way to absolve the police? Can you share some of your experiences, Nico, growing up in Little Village, that part of the city, in that neighborhood, and how it relates to the kids there?
Well, here's the thing. I didn't really grow up in Little Village. I moved here about a year ago. But the thing is, though, I had friends here prior to that. And I also grew up in Pilsen, and they were very similar back then, about 10 years ago. And the thing is too, yes, both Pilsen's thriving now, but back then it was still a little bit more in poverty. Due to gentrification, Pilsen's just getting a little bit better, but it's making it better for a more whitewashed neighborhood than it was with heavy culture back then with Mexicans. And even prior before that, it was heavy culture within Polish neighborhood. But Little Village is always just like kind of just like put like behind, and like we were at a rally the other day. I think it was Casey and I. We were like over there trying to talk about like how the rent is too high and how they're trying to gentrify Little Village. And right now, people are trying to take advantage of people in Little Village just because they realize like that we can't do anything. People of color, it's hard for them to do anything because there's just like no money for them. The aldermen don't really care. And like, especially like the aldermen with this shooting of Adam Toledo, it really made me upset of what he said. He said it was a justified shooting. How can you say that? How can you be an alderman for a Little Village and say that it was a justified shooting after everybody, thousands of eyes saw that video? And the thing is too, just to go ahead and say it, that officer did not do his job correctly. He went ahead and he pursued someone on foot by himself without backup. And then the thing that makes me even more upset, because this is what really happened, because we all saw this in the video, but from my perspective and from other people who have seen it too and listened really carefully to the audio, Adam Toledo complied to everything that officer was saying. We all saw it. And as soon as he turned around, what did that officer do? He shot him in the chest and then proceeded to make it look as if it was another rival gang that shot Adam Toledo. And then he tried to show a fake empathy towards him, saying, hey, stay with me. That's what made me really sick to my stomach. And the thing is that they know that they could do that because of racial profiling. And they know that they can get away with it because Adam Toledo was a person of color.
You're right. I mean, when we see all of these odious comments on social media where people are holding the parents accountable and why this, why that, these are people who don't live in these neighborhoods. They think that defund the police means take all the money from the police so there's anarchy, when defund the police means how about some of the money that Mayor Lightfoot took from COVID relief to pay police overtime actually goes into funding these underprivileged neighborhoods to help safety net programs, to provide opportunities, to afford more money allotted to schools so that kids might have more of an opportunity in circumstances that they were unfortunately born into and don't have a lot of control over, when TIF funds go to the loop, when federal funds go everywhere else, but the communities that really need the aid to change things, along with an attitude and retraining the police to stop profiling people and continuing this mentality of them versus us, or from the police perspective.
I want everyone to understand that when we hear about Chicago, when people are told about Chicago, the corporate narrative is that it's nothing but violence and the city's corrupt and it's broke. Chicago's not broke. And I'm glad you brought up the TIF funds, Gary, because those resources should be allocated towards communities like in the west side and south side of Chicago. Because remember, under Mayor Rahm Emanuel's watch, 54 Chicago public schools should be shut down. Communities like in the west side and there is an echo.
Sorry, there was another window that popped open. Please continue.
All good. So these schools were shut down. Same thing as well as half the mental health facilities were shut down as well. And the thing is that if resources were allocated towards people to help out the community, if there were resources to help out after school programs, community centers, actually rebuilding our city's infrastructure and doing so much more, we could see these communities come back from the brink of gentrification. But since I've been doing groundwork and field work in Chicago since 2017, 2018, covering the gentrification in Little Village and Pilsen, people are being displaced. There's a lack of hope, and the city government is willing to turn a blind eye. All the while, we do have the resources to help end poverty. One of the things that I say on the show, especially on Hardlands Media, I love driving to our studio. It's great to go there, but under the bridges, I'm seeing more and more tent cities. I'm seeing more small businesses being shut down, and I'm seeing more people being evicted from their homes. And the thing is, we have the resources to make sure that people aren't evicted, that businesses aren't shut down, but the city government is the one that's doing it. And the thing is, people will say, well, this is a Democratic city. I'm seeing the same thing happen in Republican cities, in Democratic cities, because we got a corrupt neoliberal economic system that is crippling all of us. And what needs to be done is the people to turn out for these protests, but more importantly, during our municipal election cycles where we can actually bring in change, voter turnout has to really happen in 2023 when we have to get rid of some of these aldermen that have been in power for 20, 30, 40 plus years. We got to bring in much needed change, and people got to step up, because the only way this is going to end, the only way, and I want to give a shout out to E. Heller, who mentions 280 million in that COVID relief funds went to the police and said it could have been used to help out communities like Little Village, all over the south side of Chicago, all over the west side of Chicago. We have the money is there. It's just a weak political establishment that is dictating terms. And so long as the people are silent and obedient to the system, nothing will fundamentally change. And people have to turn out, and people have to get angry. And the sad fact is that this is something that's long overdue. We have to look at true reform and reorganize how the city has been running, because what's going on right now doesn't work, and it's hurting a lot of good people. And we can change things around.
It really doesn't work.
And the thing is, Adam Toledo, 13 years old, his whole life was ahead of him. It's not my place to say, well, he was outside at 2:30 a.m. and say, well, that's it, that's over. I can't predict the future. But who are we to dictate? Who is anyone on social media to dictate who can live and who can die? We all saw the video. We all saw the cop run down that alley. I mean, Jerry, we talked about this even before we went live yesterday. Yeah. How that cop knocked some random dude in the alley too. I mean, who was that person that he knocked down to chase after Adam Toledo? And then when Adam Toledo, his hands were up. Again, his hands were up. There was nothing in his hands. And the shot was fired. Already when the kid had his hands up,
he complied. That is the main thing.
He complied. Yeah, and look, there's an absolute understandable outrage against law enforcement in the city right now, because it's an ongoing thing. We see it over and over and over again. By the same token, I think we would all agree we have a respect for the rule of law and hopefully what law enforcement is supposed to represent. But when you've got cops out there not following rules, badly trained, escalating situations like this that result in tragedy, that's where the outrage is coming from. And it's very, very hard to not paint with a broad stroke when you wonder, okay, if it's just a few bad apples, where are the good apples holding the bad apples accountable? I feel that there's simplicity.
I actually have something on that.
Go ahead.
So when you say like, okay, so where are the good, bad apples? So like from what I heard, cops who do go ahead and say something, especially here in Chicago, they just go ahead and they just drop them. And like, some of them, I'm not sure about this. It is a rumor from what I heard from other people who had told me, but some of them do just go ahead and get murdered. And then some of them get silenced because they try to go ahead and speak out. Now, that's what I'm saying. Don't take me that for actual fact. That's just a rumor from what I heard, but it doesn't seem far-fetched.
Well, with the corruption we see, they
want to keep corruption in the city.
Yep. As long as you know there's a corrupt system that feeds that theory. Absolutely. Unfortunately, I think we want to believe in law and order and good and right, but when you're living in a corrupt system where it's enabled endlessly, yeah, you would imagine that it is what happens to the few whistleblowers. Kit, bringing this back to the fact that we don't have people coming out to vote, what have you heard like from your end as far as any potentially viable progressive candidates or candidates that might be emerging in the next election cycle that we might want to pay attention to? I haven't heard anything yet. And from the last election, I don't really feel we had much of a choice anyway, but anything from you on what you're hearing?
Look, when 2019 was happening, when we had that municipal election cycle, I think everyone was surprised that as soon as Rahm Emanuel said that I'm not going to run again for a third term, that was unheard of. We've never heard of a Chicago mayor doing that before, ever. We're so used to a dynastic rule.
And because of because he covered up Laquan McDonald, isn't it interesting? We're full circle now.
Yes,
he couldn't run again because he knew that would completely eliminate his chances. Now we're dealing with the same problem that it'll affect Lightfoot. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just find interesting that symmetry there.
And I'm glad you brought it up, because in 2023, if that happens, if there is to be, if Mayor Lightfoot chooses to run again, this is something that's going to be used against her, as well as her actions of raising the bridges during the George Floyd
of course.
in 2020. And also, let's talk about the COVID-19 lockdown as well. That's going to impact her re-election as well. So as for who can potentially be the next Chicago mayor, it's not fair for me to predict the future, because, again, anything can happen. She could choose to run again, but whether or not she gets the full support like she did in the last election is yet to be seen. And maybe we are seeing a repeat of 2019, where we're seeing 20-plus mayoral candidates running for that office. And then here we go again. I mean, this is something that's going to be the new norm for Chicago, and that is every election cycle, it's going to be 20-plus people, and that one mayor who wins out will be a one-term mayor, because you just can't go back to business as usual again. Chicago has gone through so much at this point. If anything, really, I'm more hopeful for the aldermanic races. I think that's where we can bring in some real change and finally some real accountability for the office of mayor here in the city of Chicago.
I highly agree.
There's one thing I want to bring up, and that is the office of mayor here in the city of Chicago. It wasn't always like this. That seat, let's call it like a monarch's throne. The mayor is the final voice. The mayor can dictate what can and cannot happen throughout the city. At one point, before Old Man Daley took control, it was the aldermen, and yes, they were just as corrupt too, a council that was able to run the city until Old Man Mayor Daley just made that seat depowered to be what it is, and that's why Mayor Daley and his son and so many others were able to be in power for so long. Now, why do I have hope for this aldermanic election, especially for 2023? We're seeing a lot of progressives and independents step up, and we saw that during 2019. Not too long ago, it was just only Alderman Rosa, who was just the only Democratic Socialist independent that was in the city council. Now we're up to 6, and each one of those aldermanic individuals have done their own fair thing in regards to bringing economic equality, as well as bringing real accountability to the city government. So what we need is to see more people across the city of Chicago step up for these aldermanic positions, Cook County commissioner positions, and maybe, and this will be a long shot, maybe someone progressive enough to be mayor of the city of Chicago.
Yeah, and then what's interesting too, Kit, is like people don't realize that I think it's now like the Progressive Caucus is, I think it's like 11 or 15 now. All the people who are making up having like a substantial understanding of like what is so broken about this system. And a lot of people from Chicago don't realize, like you said, Kit, the mayor has so much power in the city of Chicago, and really has me personally, at this point, if any elected official doesn't follow through on what they promise in a single term, they're out. Like, this is not the point of having politicians around so they can lie to us and do nothing, right? A lot of people, maybe, I hope not,
of course,
career-oriented people think that they can get into a position like that.
Adding on to you.
You know what I mean? Kind of just like get some clout and get some money and get shit on their resume so they can be in the U.S. Senate someday or run for a Supreme, or whatever their ambitions are. Like you said, there's TIF funding. There's the ability to implement an elected school board, an elected police accountability board. The ability to close down schools and mental health facilities the way Rahm Emanuel did. They lean so hard into the neoliberal, we have to implement austerity measures because budgets and this and that, and yet will not take the insane surplus of tax money and willing to invest it in other neighborhoods. They just don't do it. They like to do stupid power play moves or do you guys remember the fucking Star Wars museum that Rahm Emanuel was trying to
God,
yeah.
Oh
And then the DePaul football stadium, these are huge, multi-million-dollar projects. And for what?
Because Melanie Hobson was from Chicago and she married George Lucas. That's what it was all about.
Yeah, it was.
They were entitled to that lakefront property.
Yeah, and they won. But the point is that when they have money available for bullshit like this, but not to,
what's one thing that's crazy too?
Programs that are going to keep kids like Adam Toledo off the street. And,
also just that Blue Line station that they made.
Yeah, Nico, let Nico chime in for a moment. Go ahead. Nico, you were gonna add something. Nico, you were gonna add something. I think you wanted to say something. Can you hear me?
Like that blue line station, like on the north side, they made that whole thing when you didn't need it.
Yeah. Well, they've also got the Belmont pass through now, which is going to save commuters from the north side, what, 2 or 3 minutes off their commute from getting from the north side into the loop for
No,
work.
I'm saying, like, he's completely right,
Yeah.
No, like I'm saying, like I'm just kind of adding on to what Casey said. Like he's right. If the mayor or something. Yeah, am I not?
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead, Nico. We're waiting to hear on your.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
We can hear you. We just want to not talk so there's no echo. So you go ahead and talk.
Okay.
Nico, go ahead. I don't know if he can hear us. I don't know if there's a Nico. Can you hear us?
I mean, I know what he's getting at. I mean, there's a lot of there's an incredible wealth in the city in terms of potential of the youth who, again, one of the organizers, kid from Pilsen, was out there like saying in a little speech when we all got.
I don't know if you guys can hear me or not. Like
and Logan, he was saying that he is so proud of like kids now, like kids Adam's age, who are getting into seeing the trajectory of how they could. I mean, what did he say? He said that a lot of us grow up in Chicago feeling like they could be.
So like, kind of just going on to like what Casey said. I do believe, like, if a mayor doesn't say anything. I'm having camera difficulties. I have like a really bad lag.
Guys, I think what's happening is there might be a delay on Nico's end, and he doesn't realize when he's heard or when someone else is speaking. So we apologize for the tech difficulties there.
I agree.
Okay. But Nico, I just texted you. If you can hear me, go ahead and speak. Otherwise, maybe we'll let Casey continue. All right, Casey, go ahead.
Yeah, there was a great organizer named Kid from Pilsen who was speaking when we were all down on a knee at Milwaukee and Logan and Kedzie. We were at Kimball, Milwaukee and Kimball. He was saying that like too many people grow up in Chicago feeling like Adam Toledo, a lot of people who get, it's very easy to just not want to interact with a broken education system, for there to be few like community resources, where, I understand that one of the things that, like, for example, I guess Gallery 37, right? Like Maggie Daly started this, take some city money, design a program to keep kids occupied in the hours that they're not in school. Right. And so when things like that start to go away, not that I don't think that after school matters is and anytime soon having any trouble of going away, but what we need is more of that, so that kids are not growing up in Chicago feeling like they could be another Adam Toledo. Like they're looking for something, they're developing their identity. And again, kids are young, they're like, I'm at the point where, like, I'm 25 now. It's sort of hard for me to remember, but I can still remember like being a kid and thinking like, okay, well, should I sell the prescription like Adderall that my mom told me I didn't have to take because I didn't think I needed it? And she's right, by the way. I didn't really need to take it. It was overprescribed back then. But still, I could have been like, hey, let's take these pills and like sell them to my classmates in the 7th grade, and make some money, and then take that money and then just blow off steam because it's fucking, it's weird and chaotic growing up in neighborhoods that don't get enough love and attention, and the love and attention can come in the form of just, having a more, I don't know, how do you say, like a more of like a promise of not only like an educational promise, but like a cultural promise,
a social
trajectory that is outside of even if it's like minor criminality or if it's very like intense criminality, you know? And to the people who may be hearing this on just waiting to play devil's advocate, be like, well, okay, you know, starts in the home and where's the personal responsibility? And we hear a lot of this, but this is generally coming from people who are either of generations or the generations themselves, the people who have grown up insulated from a lot of this stuff, or who have just been like a token, like, well, I made it out, or you know what I mean? And they're not really recognizing that, like, I mean, if you take a step back, we just have such a huge culture, especially like in entertainment, of police acting as, how do I say, like Batman, you know what I mean? Like there's just
Hey, don't go dissing the Batman.
They're operating on the presumption that if you disobey a cop directly, or if you disobey like kind of what is normal or what is a appropriate lifestyle, or you know what I mean, that you are completely justified that you just be executed and that you don't deserve sympathy, when what it comes down to is literally people not doing their jobs correctly, taking lives, you know? Like none of this has to happen. And no matter who whatever was who was shot by a cop, whatever they were doing at the time or whatever they were involved with in their personal life, like it shouldn't have any bearing on whether or not they survive an encounter with law enforcement. And these people, like these detractors, they just don't understand that, like, they are not believing in innocence until proven guilty. They're not believing in the law. They believe in authority, right? That is like, you know, and this is why I think as far back as the 60s, they were saying, you know, equating the way that cops then were, of course, it was a lot more brutal like in the 60s, but still like the underlying presumption is there. It's fascist. It's an appeal to authority based on culture. And you either are with, you know what I mean? There's no room for discussing, well, okay, so maybe for the last 30 years, the schools have been like sort of on a downward trajectory for funding, and you know there's a lot of like, you know, hardship in neighborhoods, especially on the south and west sides, that just make it so difficult to participate in the education system, which is frankly the bedrock of a lot of these problems, right? And there's a YouTuber, I think his name is Echo Gecko, and he talks a lot about sprawl and zoning laws, and it's kind of like boring stuff, but he does have a couple essays that tie in how police forces, and especially in the 90s, and this culture of security was developed. This is what he posits, is that it was developed to make people who are not from the city feel safe coming into the city, so that they'll spend their money here before they go and take the train or go drive back out to the suburbs. And it's all tied to white flight. Like they took all that wealth with them, and now we have to like ponder to like, you know, a tourist class that is from our own suburbs coming into the city and spending a lot of money, especially in the downtown areas, that produces the need for this over-policing and security culture in order to make them feel safe, so that they'll want to come to the city and spend their money.
They're the ones who are passing judgment right out of the gate on kids in the city who are caught in these circumstances.
And I'm not
here for families. It's not easy for us to come downtown because of all the crime. You hit the nail right on the head, Casey.
Let's also hand this over to Nico. I know you want to add something in, so Nico.
Actually, guys, real quick, I have some personal business that I have to take care of. Okay. I really can't be on here any longer. But just before I go, I'm going to try to do this often while we're on the air. I just want to recommend a really great book. It's kind of a non sequitur, but it's called Indigenous Peoples in Globalization. And it just talks about the struggle between, they're just sort of like analyzing indigenous cultures and how the way that they structured tribes, communities as organizers, how we can take some of those lessons and apply them to things like community policing. And when because we're all eventually talking about defunding the police, so we're going to look to some of our
retraining and defunding.
Right, we're going to look to some older modes, some pre-colonial modes of organizing and communicating and interacting to hopefully give inspiration to newer systems that are going to inevitably be less punitive, less violent, and take fewer lives. The author is Thomas Hall and James Fenelon. Again, it's Indigenous Peoples and Globalization. And with that, gents, I just want to say, mwah, I love you all and your beautiful faces, and I'll see you again very soon.
We love you too, and thanks for all your good work and everything you had to share here tonight.
All right.
Be safe.
Let's hand this over now to Nico. I know there's a lot, you had some technical issues, so let's have you say your piece right now, and then Jerry, I think you could follow
kind of wrap stuff up. Yeah.
Okay. So can you guys hear me okay now?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So earlier, before I had started getting technical difficulties, Casey was talking about how the mayors and the aldermen, how they don't keep their promises. And I definitely agree. If some of them don't keep their promises, why do we keep them in office for so long? Why do we continue to have them to stay in office and continue to break promise after promise after promise? And I personally believe that this has to do with an age gap. So I'm technically not youth anymore, but I still kind of fall I guess in a younger category because at 27, but still it's just
you're young.
Our voices go ahead and just the youth, they don't care. They really don't. And it's affecting all of us growing up.
But I'm seeing more young people engaged now, though, Nico. And this is what.
Yeah, and that's what made me happy.
Yeah. Okay. We're getting to that. Yeah.
Yeah, it made me really happy to see that there was a lot of teens there. Teens. Before, when 10 years ago, when I was I remember when they were it was the G10 thing, and I was at the protest for that. It was all older adults, in their 20s and 30s, and they were all trying to just protest it. They didn't want the G10 there. I kind of forgot what that was about since it was 10 years ago, but I was one of the fewer young people there. So now seeing that all these children there, it only just tells me one thing, because they're getting affected by all these broken promises that are made. That brings me back to the Adam Toledo thing, the alderman, he said it was a justified shooting. And he's the alderman of Little Village. That really gets me to think, do we really need him as the alderman of Little Village now? Because if you're really from Little Village, you would care about your district, the people that you're actually an alderman for, but you don't. You really don't. And so I honestly, what I'm trying to get at is I do believe that they should probably have at least someone of a younger age who is willing to actually try to do more promising things, to be an alderman official. I do believe that they should change the age. I forgot how old you need to be an alderman, or what it was what it had to be. I can't really remember, but I do believe that they need someone who's at least more in their community and more with that's trying to get into the youth, trying to get to them and trying to understand what the problem really is.
We saw Jamal Green doing that last election cycle, and he seemed to be one of those stand-up progressive candidates who was young. And I think more young people, thankfully, are getting more involved because we have this apparatus around us, the internet, to keep people connected and finding the truths that mainstream media is not sharing because of their agenda. We're here on YouTube streaming, Hardlands Media, Kit and Daniel. We have the opportunity here on Chicago Corner now to go out and try to get the facts to present so people can make up their own minds. I think there's the democratization of the internet with younger people being able to get information that's not just being spoon-fed to them will hopefully make a big difference in this next election cycle, as well as more people getting engaged, not being dissuaded or feeling that their vote is hopeless, that they don't exercise that right to get these better candidates in. We're over an hour. Not that I am unhappy talking long, but I think it's been a really great broadcast. And unless either of you have something more to add, our audience hopefully has been with us for the whole stretch. We can always talk some more on some other issues, but anything else either of you gentlemen would like to add?
there's one thing I want to bring up, and I'll keep on bringing this up so long as we are doing these live streams. If you live in the Chicagoland area or you know anyone that lives in the city of Chicago, 2023 will be our next city election. We need to have a higher voter turnout. When we covered it during 2019, the voter turnout was low. We can't afford not to turn out to vote. And I understand everyone has their opinions of electoral politics, but this is just another pathway for change. But the first step is people to step up. With that being said, I have nothing else to add.
And
for having me on here.
yeah, and
I want to actually add on to you, Kit. I do believe that, like, you know, we do need to go ahead and to like unite as like a person. Sorry, one moment.
Go ahead.
Okay. There we go. So I do believe that we do need to unite like together as a one people and to go ahead and to actually make a change. Actually go ahead and like, you know, to unify each other. And like that 3 years it's going to fly by. And we all need to stop being empathetic. I mean, not empathetic, apathetical towards a lot of these situations. And we just need to go ahead and take our voice as a people to make an actual change. And that starts like with like, you know, the protests and stuff like that. That starts like, I think Casey brought it up the other day. Everyone is always relying on social media. I do believe that we need to start bringing back word of mouth stuff because like it's just for paper trails and stuff like that. And that also, that just goes ahead and just, it gets people to like actually start to talk to each other and not using social media and stop being afraid to go out there and talk to each other about like concerns and matters that are happening in our communities. We need to unite together and we need to make a change, and it needs to be fast because sooner or later, it's just like, there's not going to be nothing to save. I hate to say it.
And if people can't afford to volunteer their time, I'll say this. I personally volunteered in 2 mayoral campaigns over the last 2 election cycles, not for candidates that ended up in the mayor's seat. And I was encouraged there, seeing a lot of young people volunteering and participating in those campaigns. So, you know, to speak to Kit's and Nico's points, anybody out there, young, old, whatever age, if you can afford to volunteer for a candidate that represents your values and your ideals, put the time in to get the word on the streets this next election cycle. So hopefully we'll have some better choices to occupy, what is it, the 5th floor downtown at City Hall? Gentlemen, thank you. I want to say good night to Chicago. Everyone be safe out there. I was predicting it was going to be a long weekend the other day, given the protests, but thankfully I don't, from what I've followed, there have been no violent eruptions, and I'm hopeful and optimistic that we'll get through this weekend and see what other news transpires as far as this larger issue we're talking about about escalation versus de-escalation and this culture that's just got to change. Gentlemen, thank you. Good night, Chicago, and see you next time.